She was 21 and homeless, no bedroom, no winter coat, no family key, just a worn handbag and 10 crumpled dollars she had counted 3 times beneath a station clock. And with that $10, she bought a forgotten amber polisher's studio tied to old Maiden Lane, New York County, New York, off trade maps since 1894. Half the rear roof sagged toward the alley. The main polishing shaft had rusted solid in place. The county had condemned the structure on October 14, 2022, with demolition planned for spring. But beneath the hardwood core of its largest wax-blackened canvas buff was a sealed hollow chamber no one had opened in generations, holding enough to alter the shape of her life. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Phoebe Mercer had been measuring her whole life without knowing it. As a girl, she measured rooms by floorboards, winters by frost at the windows, and her parents' better weeks by whether the kitchen light stayed on after supper. Their narrow apartment stood above a repair shop where radiators knocked through the night. She learned that worn things were not useless. They simply asked for attention before judgment. Her father, Daniel, repaired watch cases until his eyesight weakened, then took bookkeeping work. He showed Phoebe how to hold a caliper without squeezing and how to write figures another person could trust. Her mother, Ruth, kept the household exact, but fear made her increasingly obedient to whoever held the bills. The person Phoebe loved visiting was Daniel's father, Elias Mercer, who rented a back room above a jeweler's supply house. Every Saturday he worked amber there. He let her sort cloudy Baltic pieces into wooden trays by density cracks and the way lamplight entered the resin. Elias used fine steel files to remove oxidized crust, then cooled each piece with water before drilling because heat could soften the resin. He showed her the canvas, its stitched face dark with Tripoli and pumice, and made her wait through the slow polishing instead of pressing harder. At noon, they ate rye bread by the window, while freight brakes squealed below. She was never allowed to hurry the last pass. Pressure hides mistakes. Patience reveals what survived. Elias told her once. Phoebe understood only the first half then. Years later, she remembered his thumb resting lightly against a dull amber bead until its buried light appeared. Elias died during a wet March when Phoebe was 16. By the time Daniel reached the rented room, the landlord had cleared the bench for unpaid rent. The canvas buffs, hand drills, files, raw amber ledgers, and Elias's brass lamp were gone into a dealer's truck. Daniel recovered only a damp envelope of receipts and never forgave himself for arriving late. 5 years later, the Mercer's debt belonged to Gideon Vale, a private creditor who spoke softly enough that people leaned toward him before realizing he had decided the terms. He came in a charcoal overcoat, squared his folders with the table, and called their home collateral. No court officer stood beside him. No sheriff read an order. Yet he carried duplicate keys, a locksmith's invoice, and men downstairs labeling furniture before the family understood what authority he claimed. On November 27, 2022, Phoebe found her father's brass caliper in the kitchen drawer and closed it inside her fist. Vale watched while a worker pasted a seizure notice across the cabinet. Her handbag sat on the floor with $10 inside, all the cash left after groceries. Vale glanced at the caliper. "Take your purse and leave this house now." 8 words. Phoebe looked at Ruth. Her mother stood by the sink holding a dish towel with both hands. She did not defend the caliper or look at the notice. After several seconds, she lowered her eyes, and Phoebe understood that silence could sign something, too. She returned the caliper, picked up the handbag, and stepped into the cold without another object from the apartment. For 6 weeks, she moved according to warmth. 2 nights in Newark, she slept upright near Penn Station until security cleared the benches. In Jersey City, she found a church basement with 12 cots and a boiler that clicked like cooling metal. Manhattan gave her libraries by day, a women's shelter on East 30th when a bed opened, and once the back pew of an all-night chapel. She guarded the $10 bill as if it belonged to someone else. Bottle returns and small errands gave her $7.40 for food one week, then $4.85, then 2 10 She learned which diners sold day-old rolls for 50 cents and which subway entrances blocked the wind. The 10 remained folded behind an expired library card. On the 39th day, she entered the Jefferson Market branch of the New York Public Library because sleet had soaked her sweater. Near the community notices was a county surplus circular beneath a tax help flyer. Most entries were vacant strips or structures awaiting removal. One line was different. Former Amber Polisher Studio, deed transfer, $10 cash, as is condemned. Beneath it was a parcel number and a note that the workshop traced its trade records to Maiden Lane. Phoebe copied the parcel number onto a discarded checkout slip. The words Amber Polisher did not feel nostalgic. They felt exact. She asked the librarian to locate the county filing, read the demolition notation twice, and check the bus routes before closing. At 6:10. The next morning, she unfolded the bill she had refused to spend, bought the cheapest ticket that would carry her toward the parcel, and kept the remaining distance for her feet. By nightfall, Phoebe would be walking toward a condemned door that still remembered the work her family had lost. The bus carried Phoebe north through gray morning traffic past apartment blocks powdered with old snow and warehouses whose loading doors were still shut. Her ticket took her only as far as the final local stop. From there, the county directions required another 11 miles on foot. She walked 6, before darkness hardened the shoulders of the road, then slipped into an open hay barn behind a stone wall and slept beneath 2 horse blankets the farmer had left folded over a stall door. The temperature fell to 23 degrees. At dawn, her shoes were stiff with frost. She reached the small commercial strip shortly before 10, moving past Sutter's Hardware with galvanized pails in the window, Bell and Finch Pharmacy beneath a green awning, Doris Pike's Corner Cafe with steam clouding the glass. Brannan Feed and Seed beside a stack of salt bags and Heller's Shoe Repair, where a handwritten sign promised heels while you waited. Nothing in the place appeared prosperous, but everything appeared used. The county office occupied the first floor of an old brick municipal building near the intersection. Inside wet boots had polished the black and white floor dull at the doorway. Phoebe followed a brass arrow marked Property Records and entered a room smelling of paper radiator heat and stamp pad ink. The clerk, behind the counter, had a narrow braid of white hair falling over one shoulder and a blue cardigan repaired at both elbows. Her nameplate read Miriam Halloway, Deputy Clerk. Phoebe slid the parcel number across. Miriam read it, looked at Phoebe, then read it again. You understand the roof is unsound? Yes, ma'am. You understand there is no certified heat? Yes, ma'am. You understand the water service was disconnected? Yes, ma'am. You understand demolition remains authorized unless the violations are cured? Yes, ma'am. Miriam removed her glasses. And you still want the deed? Phoebe placed the $10 bill on the counter. For several seconds, neither woman touched it. Then, Miriam pulled a ledger toward herself, checked 3 lines against a county map, and turned the book around. Phoebe signed where the clerk's fingernail rested. Her hand shook only on the first letter of her surname. The transfer required 2 more forms, 1 liability acknowledgement and a receipt handwritten in blue carbon. Miriam took the $10, flattened it beneath her palm, and worked a heavy brass seal over the deed. The stamp landed with a deep mechanical clap. Keep this dry, she said. She drew a route on the back of an obsolete tax map copy. Phoebe was to take Broadway north, follow the narrower service road beyond the old freight cut pass, a retaining wall of dark Manhattan schist, then turn where 2 walnut trees stood opposite a boarded carriage house. The studio occupied the final legal parcel before the ground narrowed toward the water. Miriam paused while writing the last direction. Mercer. Phoebe looked up. That was your grandfather's name. Elias Mercer. The clerk's pen stopped. Miriam leaned back as though the room had changed temperature. Amber Man. Phoebe said nothing. I knew that name from the old trade books. Miriam rose and went to a metal cabinet. She returned with a thin property folder whose corners had softened with handling. This parcel had repair petitions in the 80s and 90s. One of the men who kept asking the city not to clear the old equipment was an Elias Mercer. Phoebe felt the counter beneath both hands. He owned it. No. Miriam shook her head. Not according to anything here, but he signed as a tradesman and witness. 3 applications. 1987, 1991, 1994. She angled the paper toward Phoebe. The signature was unmistakable. Elias had always made the capital E with a long middle stroke almost like the arm of a balance scale. Phoebe touched no part of the page. Why would he care about this place? Miriam looked toward the locked records cabinets. That I cannot tell you. The last owner died without heirs we could locate. Taxes went unpaid. The building passed through foreclosure and then to the county. Most people saw a demolition bill. And my grandfather. He saw something worth keeping. Miriam made a photocopy without charging her and tucked it behind the deed. When Phoebe reached for the $10 receipt, the clerk placed that on top as well. The bill itself went into the cash drawer, separated from the 20s and 5s because it was the only 10 collected that morning. Outside, the wind had shifted off the river. Phoebe followed the route with the deed buttoned under her sweater. Broadway gave way to a quieter stretch where traffic thinned and the pavement carried patched seams from old utility cuts. Beyond the freight embankment, she passed one occupied house, a narrow clapboard structure with a rust-red porch. An elderly man stacking split wood lifted 2 fingers in greeting. His black dog came to the edge of the yard, barked once, and then sat. "Studio's farther down," the man called. Phoebe nodded. He seemed about to add something, but instead returned to the woodpile. The 2 walnut trees appeared a quarter-mile later, their bare limbs interlocked over the road. Beyond them, almost hidden behind sumac and a leaning plank fence, stood the property she had purchased for every dollar she possessed. The studio was larger than the classified photograph suggested, roughly 32 feet long and 18 wide, built of brick at the lower courses and weather-darkened timber above. 3 courses near the rear wall had lost mortar. The roof pitched unevenly beneath patched slate and rolled asphalt. A short brick chimney leaned perhaps 2 inches east of true. Over the front door hung a wooden sign whose paint had nearly vanished, but under the lichen she could still make out the ghost of a word, amber. Phoebe did not go in immediately. She walked the perimeter first. At the rear, runoff had eaten a shallow trench beside the foundation. One gutter hung loose. A small window had been boarded from inside, and the sill beneath it was soft enough for her thumbnail to enter. Yet the main walls did not bow. The chimney base remained square. One corner post showed rot but not collapse. She had seen worse things remain standing. The front key required both hands. Rust resisted the first turn, then gave with a dry snap that startled a pigeon from the roofline. The door opened 6 inches before dragging across the floor. Cold air breathed outward, carrying old beeswax rancid polishing compound damp wood, and the faint pine-bitter smell of oxidized resin. Phoebe pushed harder. Somewhere above, her grit slid down a rafter. The front room had once received customers. A narrow counter ran along one wall beneath empty display brackets. Frost clouded the inside of the windows. When she rubbed one pane with her sleeve, afternoon light crossed the room and caught thousands of amber crumbs embedded between the floorboards, dull pieces no larger than grains of corn. Her boots made the boards answer differently at every step. Near the back doorway, something brittle cracked beneath her heel. She bent and found a fragment of amber opaque brown on the surface. She rubbed it between thumb and finger. Friction warmed it enough to release a faint resinous scent. Elias had taught her that smell. The workroom beyond was darker. A long bench stood beneath 2 windows. Steel arbors projected from a line shaft fixed to the wall, and belts hung from overhead pulleys like dried leather vines. 3 small buffs had sagged on their spindles. Against the far wall stood the largest wheel nearly 3 feet across, built from hundreds of stitched canvas leaves compressed around a hardwood center. Its face was blackened with old Tripoli grease and wax. Phoebe placed both palms against the edge. It did not move. The spindle had seized completely. A mouse rustled beneath the bench, then silence returned. When Phoebe breathed through her mouth, she could taste dust and metal. Her fingertips came away brown. The cold entered through the soles of her shoes, but the room had a stillness different from the stations and shelters. Nothing here was asking her to move along. Before dark, she found an iron hand pump in the yard and coaxed 3 muddy strokes from it before the mechanism failed. There would be no drinking water tonight. She ate half a roll, saved from morning, and used newspaper from the front counter to block a gap beneath the door. She chose a place on the floor beside the old bench where the roof looked strongest. Her handbag became a pillow. The copied sheet bearing Elias Mercer's signature remained beneath her coat, pressed against her ribs. For the first time in 6 weeks, she lay somewhere no guard could order her to leave when the building closed. Above her, the loose gutter tapped once in the wind. Then again. Phoebe stared into the dark toward the enormous, motionless canvas wheel. The roughest shell often exists only to protect what is still alive inside. By sunrise, Phoebe was already outside with a length of bent wire, a borrowed bucket, and the stubborn hand pump between her knees. The first 3 days gave her no discovery except the building itself. She learned that the well cylinder would prime if she poured half a quart down the throat before working the handle slowly. The first water came brown, the second cloudy, and by the 9th bucket it ran cold enough to ache in her teeth. The outhouse leaned, but remained usable after she replaced one hinge with wire. Indoors, she memorized every floorboard by sound, the hollow complaint near the counter, the firm pine beside the stove, the double creak 3 steps inside the workroom. She slept where the wood sounded strongest. On the 4th morning, she walked back toward town, carrying Miriam's copied map inside her coat. Sutter's Hardware opened at 7. The owner was a thick-shouldered man named Arthur Sutter, with a silver crescent scar under his left ear and a pencil worn permanently behind it. The store smelled of rope, machine oil, kerosene, and dry seed dust. Arthur listened without interrupting while Phoebe explained the deed and the condemnation deadline. "You have money." "No." "Credit." "No." "Family account." Phoebe looked at the counter. "No." Arthur rolled the pencil between his fingers. "Then we start smaller." He opened a ruled account book and wrote Phoebe Mercer on an empty line. "You pay when you can. You do not disappear." "I won't." "People always say that." "I know." He studied her for a moment, then pushed a stained paperback across the counter. The cover read, "Repairing Old Houses Owner's Field Manual." "My brother used that until the binding gave up. Free means you return it if you quit." Phoebe tucked it under her arm. She bought only what the studio demanded first, a chimney brush for $8.75, 20 feet of fiberglass rod for $6.40, a pound of stove cement for $2.15, 2 work gloves for $1.16, 5 gallons of kerosene for $3.90, and a small galvanized ash shovel for $1.25. Arthur wrote every figure in the ledger with no interest beside it. The chimney occupied most of that afternoon and all the next morning. Phoebe first opened the stove damper and tied an old flour sack across the firebox opening, leaving one corner loose enough to watch for falling soot. From the roof, she fed the 6-inch wire brush downward 1 rod at a time, rotating clockwise, so the threaded joints would not loosen. The first passes caught almost immediately. She withdrew the brush, scraped off flakes of hardened creosote with the ash shovel, and started again. By the 2nd hour, black dust had worked beneath her sleeves. The upper flue contained dry, brittle scale. The lower section was worse. Terry deposits clung to the brick where years of cool fires had condensed smoke before it escaped. Phoebe worked the brush from above, then from the clean-out at the base, alternating until the bristles passed without resistance. She collected nearly 3 pounds of soot and creosote in the sack. It took 6 hours and 40 minutes. Before lighting anything, she checked the mortar joints with a mirror and a candle flame. No draft pulled sideways through the masonry. She filled 2 hairline gaps with stove cement, waited until morning, then built a test fire no larger than both her hands. The smoke lifted. It did not curl into the room. Phoebe watched the flame for 10 minutes before adding another split of dry wood the neighbor had left beside her door without a note. She balanced a dented saucepan above the stove and warmed water with potatoes, salt, and the heel of an onion. Doris Pike had slipped into her bag when she bought yesterday's bread. Steam touched the cold window. For the first time, the studio smelled less like abandonment than supper. After eating, Phoebe began the workroom inventory. She did not count everything. Most of what filled the shelves was too damaged to matter yet. She chose what seemed to have survived on purpose. There were 3 steel needle files wrapped in waxed paper, their teeth still sharp beneath orange bloom. A hand drill with an ebony side handle turned smoothly after 2 drops of kerosene. 4 shallow wooden trays held rough amber fragments, graded from pale honey to opaque brown. A brass caliper lay inside a drawer beneath a strip of felt, its hinge green but readable. On a high shelf she found a jar labeled Tripoli, another containing gray pumice and a little tin of beeswax whose lid had fused shut. Then there was the large canvas buff. In daylight she could see that it had not merely seized. The wheel was built differently from the others. Most polishing buffs used stitched canvas circles compressed around a central flange. This one had almost 300 leaves each, cut from heavy cotton duck and sewn through with thick linen thread. Old compound had hardened along the edges until the surface resembled dark bark. The hardwood hub was nearly 8 inches thick, much heavier than required for the spindle. Phoebe opened Elias's copied petition and placed it on the bench. She read his signature once. Then she began testing the wheel. First came sound. She struck the canvas lightly with the wooden handle of the ash shovel. The outer rim answered with the dull, layered thump she expected. Closer to the hub, the sound sharpened. At the center, it changed again, not to solid wood, but to a faint enclosed knock. Phoebe stopped. She struck the opposite side. The same hollow answer came back. She removed the retaining nut with penetrating oil. A wrench Arthur had lent her, and 20 minutes of pressure applied without jerking. The wheel would not slide from the spindle. She cleaned the exposed shaft with kerosene, worked it back and forth less than 1/8 of an inch, then wedged 2 thin pine blocks behind the hub and alternated pressure from side to side. It moved. 1/4 inch, then half. When the wheel finally came free, Phoebe nearly fell backward under its weight. She set it flat on the bench and stood over it. It should have weighed perhaps 40 pounds. It weighed closer to 70. The rear face had been covered by a cedar disc stained almost black from age. 6 brass screws held it to the hardwood hub. 5 showed normal wear. The 6th had a slot so clean that someone had either replaced it late or protected it from use. Phoebe did not touch the screws immediately. She went outside, washed her hands at the pump, returned, and cleared the bench. Only then did she begin. The first screw resisted. She fitted the driver exactly into the slot and pushed down before turning. The second released with a dry squeal. By the 6th, her hands had stopped trembling. The cedar disc lifted less than 1 inch. Something beneath it shifted. Phoebe lowered it again. She listened. No metal rolled. No glass broke. She raised the disc carefully and leaned it against the wall. Inside the oversized hardwood center was a cavity lined with tarred cloth. The first package was long and narrow, wrapped in oiled linen. Phoebe unfolded it on the bench and found a set of amber working tools. 2 burnishers, a miniature bow drill, 6 fine files, a steel divider, and a hand-ground scraping knife. Each handle carried the same tiny 3-point mark cut near the ferrule. The second parcel contained raw Baltic amber, not chips, pieces. One was the size of a walnut, cloudy yellow beneath a rough gray-brown crust. Another showed a dark shape suspended near its center. Phoebe turned that piece toward the window and saw delicate legs, a thorax, and the fine outline of wings locked inside the resin. She put it down at once. Beneath the amber lay a folded drawing on linen paper. The diagram showed progressive cuts around and inclusion with arrows marking the safe direction of removal, so pressure would travel away from the trapped fossil rather than through it. Several notes specified cold water drilling shallow passes and no heat above body temperature during the final shaping. The third object was a small platinum bead chain sealed in a paper envelope. The last was a rectangular tin box. Phoebe sat before opening it. The lid had been tied with faded cotton tape and sealed at one corner with dark red wax. The impression was nearly gone. She eased the tape free, instead of cutting it, placed both lengths beside the box, then slipped the edge of the scraping knife beneath the lid. Inside was money, not stacked neatly, wrapped. Small paper rolls filled both ends with folded notes lying flat beneath them, and heavier cloth packets at the center. Phoebe removed each parcel in order and arranged them on the bench exactly as they had rested. She counted twice. The paper currency came first. Old but spendable bills mixed with earlier series that would require verification. Beneath them were coins, $20 St. Gaudens, double eagles, $10 Liberty Head eagles, $5 Indian Head, half eagles, and rolls of silver Morgan dollars. One cloth packet held only ordinary change, perhaps included because whoever packed the box believed every piece mattered. Phoebe used the brass caliper tray as a tally surface. $20 became 40. 40 became 100. The numbers moved beyond anything she had ever held. She stopped every 50 coins and started a second column so fatigue could not change the total. When she finished the first count, she stared at the figure, drank water, and began again from the opposite side. The second count matched. $31,500. Exactly. At the bottom of the tin lay one more object wrapped in dark blue wool. Phoebe opened the cloth and found a World War I victory medal. Its bronze surface, dulled but intact, the rainbow suspension ribbon had faded toward brown at the folds. On the reverse, beneath the winged figure, a tiny paper label had been tied through the ring. Kikujuku. No name, only the year. Phoebe placed the medal beside the money and leaned both palms on the bench. The room had become very quiet. Outside, afternoon thinned toward blue. She should have opened the folded letter beneath the coins. She could see its edges, now cream paper tied separately with linen thread. She did not. Money could be counted. Tools could be named. A letter required another kind of readiness. Phoebe put the currency back into the tin in smaller, careful stacks. She left the heirloom tools and platinum chain on the bench, covered them with a clean cloth, and slipped the unread letter inside her coat. Then she walked through the rear door and followed the frozen ground toward the water. The river lay beyond the walnut trees, dark under the January sky. Thin ice had gathered in the still margins while the center moved black and steady toward the south. Phoebe stood there until her fingers hurt, watching pieces of reflected light break apart and join again downstream. Behind her, the studio chimney carried one narrow thread of smoke into the evening. She did not calculate what the money could buy. She did not decide what belonged to her. She only held the unread letter against her ribs and watched the water move past the bank without asking permission to continue. The roughest shell often exists only to protect what is still alive inside. Morning entered the workroom through frost before it entered through glass. Phoebe fed 2 narrow splits into the stove, warmed her hands over the iron top, and placed the cream envelope on the bench beneath the east window. When she untied the linen thread, she recognized the handwriting before she read a word. The capital M leaned forward. The lowercase r ended in a short upward hook. Elias had copied that hand in one of his old notebooks. Phoebe sat down. The letter began, "My dear one, whoever you are, if you have opened the wheel, then either the shop has survived longer than I expected, or someone patient enough to listen has finally entered it. My name is Adelaide Mercer. In October of 1989, Dr. Helen Ward at New York Presbyterian Hospital told me that the cancer in my pancreas had spread beyond what surgery could repair. She gave me months, not years. I came back here because there were things I could still put in order with my hands. The work began before me." Matthias Mercer came from Königsberg to New York in 1858 and cut Baltic amber for pipe stems near Maiden Lane. His daughter, Clara Mercer, learned the wheels beside him and took the bench in 1883. Clara's son, Thomas Mercer, moved the trade north after the old jewelry district changed, keeping the files, patterns, and account books together. Thomas taught my father, Samuel Mercer, who taught me in 1931 when I was 12, and too small to reach the large buff without a crate beneath my shoes. 4 generations believed the work belonged to whoever cared enough to do it properly. The shop closed on June 17, 1957. For more than 30 years afterward, the wheels remained silent. My husband, Robert James Mercer, was killed in France during the Meuse-Argonne fighting in October 1918. The medal in this box came home without him. I kept it because grief like amber can be carried without being displayed. If you mean to use the material, work cold. Amber softens long before stone does. Keep drilling water below 70 degrees Fahrenheit and lift the bit every 3 seconds so the hole does not gum. Remove oxidized crust in shallow strokes, always away from a visible inclusion. On the canvas wheel, use 2 parts fine Tripoli to 1 part pumice with only enough beeswax to hold the powder. Polish in short passes of 20 seconds, then let the piece rest in your palm. If it grows hot enough that you notice the heat stop, there is one drawing beneath the raw amber showing how to approach an inclusion from its strongest edge. Do not chase clarity so far that you destroy what gives the piece its reason for being. Elias Mercer knew this room. How was my grandson? When he was young, I taught him at this same bench. He later worked elsewhere because the city changed, rents changed, and people wanted speed more than workmanship. Still, he came back. He repaired the roof, twice oiled the line shaft, and petitioned against demolition after I no longer had the strength to climb the stairs. I asked him not to tell the family about the money because money discovered before its purpose is understood has a way of becoming someone else's argument. This money is not payment for suffering. It is not a prize. It is stored labor. Some of it came from finished amber sold during years when I lived very simply. Some came from Robert's insurance. Some came from my father's savings. I preserved it because there might come a person after us who needed time more than luxury. Use it first to make the building safe, then learn slowly. Inheritance is not owning what the dead kept. It is agreeing to finish one honest task they could not finish themselves and leaving something useful for the person whose name you will never know. Behind the back door, 32 paces toward the river, there is a granite marker half buried beneath the roots of the older walnut tree. You will know it by the 3-point polishing mark cut into its face. Do not move it. It marks where Clara planted the first tree after Matthias died. The small platinum chain belonged to her. The lamp is Elias's. If it still works, light it once. You do not owe us a museum. You do not owe us obedience. You owe the craft only patience and yourself enough mercy to begin badly. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. Adelaide Ruth Mercer, January 4, 19Q. Phoebe reached the signature and remained still. The stove settled behind her with a soft metallic tick. She read the letter a second time more slowly. On the second reading, she stopped at Elias's name, touched the paper with one finger, and continued. When she finished, she folded the sheets precisely along their original creases. The paper had remembered where it belonged before she had. She carried the letter through the back door. The snow near the river had crusted overnight. Phoebe counted 32 paces from the threshold using heel to toe where the ground narrowed between walnut roots. On the 31st, she saw nothing. At 32, she brushed dead leaves aside with her glove. Granite showed beneath them. The marker was no larger than a loaf of bread and lay nearly flush with the earth. Its top had weathered smooth, except for 3 shallow cuts forming the same small mark she had seen on the heirloom tool handles. A walnut root passed along one side without disturbing it. Phoebe knelt and cleared only enough soil to see the symbol. She did not lift the stone. Back inside, she searched the upper shelves until she found a narrow brass lamp behind a warped cigar box. Its chimney was missing, but the reservoir remained intact. On the underside of the base, almost hidden by soot, Elias Mercer had scratched his initials. She cleaned the burner threads with a rag, trimmed the hardened wick, and added a little kerosene. The first match went out. The second caught. A small amber flame rose above the brass collar and steadied. Phoebe placed the lamp beside Adelaide's folded letter. By noon, 3 people had found reasons to pass the studio. Arthur Sutter arrived first, carrying a cardboard box with 6 stove bricks he claimed were chipped badly enough that he could not sell them. None was chipped. He left before Phoebe could argue. Miriam Halloway came next, her white braid tucked beneath a wool hat. She brought an archival envelope for the deed and another for the letter. Paper survives longer when someone bothers, she said. Near dusk. Doris Pike crossed the road with a brown sack containing bread, 2 apples, and a jar of chicken soup. She placed it on the counter, saw the lit brass lamp, and did not ask why Phoebe's eyes were swollen. She only said, "Jar comes back, food doesn't." The elderly neighbor from the woodpile left another armful of split maple against the outside wall before dark. He gave no name and knocked only once. Phoebe stood in the doorway after he had gone, looking at the wood. There were no speeches in any of it. No one had enough money to rescue anyone else. A clerk had copied a page. A hardware man had opened an account. A cafe owner had saved a meal. A neighbor had split wood for a stranger. Small things had kept her alive long enough to open a letter. If someone once offered you a small kindness when you had nowhere else to turn, tell us what they did in the comments. It does not have to sound important. Sometimes a meal, a ride, a warm room, or one person keeping their word becomes the thing we remember for the rest of our lives. That night, Phoebe returned the money to the hidden cavity and replaced the cedar disc loosely over the hub. She kept only Adelaide's letter, the platinum chain, the medal, and the old tools beside her sleeping place. Elias's brass lamp burned low on the bench until she closed its wick. Then Phoebe lay down with 4 generations within reach of her hand. The first real snow came on December 3rd and measured 4.5 inches against the step by noon. Phoebe spent that morning beside the stove with Arthur's battered repair manual open across her knees. She read the roofing chapter once for meaning again for measurements and a third time with a pencil in hand. The studio roof measured roughly 34 feet by 20 feet over both slopes. Allowing for 10% waste, she calculated 22 bundles of asphalt shingles, 3 rolls of 30-pound felt, and just under 20 pounds of galvanized roofing nails. Arthur checked the arithmetic without changing it. Then he reached beneath the hardware counter and brought out a narrow roofing hatchet with a leather-wrapped handle. "My father's," he said. Phoebe looked at him. "He died 20 years ago. Toole doesn't know." She carried it back, wrapped in brown paper. The man who appeared the next morning was the elderly neighbor with the black dog. His name was Walter Keene, 72, retired after 46 years roofing houses from Yonkers to Poughkeepsie. He wore a canvas coat polished pale at the elbows and refused the money Phoebe tried to offer. Roof first, pride later. They spent the first day stripping loose asphalt and rotted felt from the south slope. 2 rafters near the rear had softened where the leak entered. Walter showed Phoebe how to sister each damaged member with straight lumber, fastening the new board well beyond the compromise section rather than merely covering the rot. He snapped a chalk line across the first clean course. "Follow that, not your eyes." Phoebe learned Walter's 3-stroke nail technique. Set the shingle with fingertips. Clear 1 light strike to seat the nail a second to drive a third to finish flush without crushing the mat. On the 4th morning, he tapped 1 nail with the hatchet. "That nail's proud." Phoebe reached for the hammer. "Pull it." 11 days passed between stripping, sistering, felting, shingling, flashing the chimney, and resetting the loose gutter edge. Twice, wind forced them down before noon. Once, freezing rain sealed the ladder rungs and ended the day before breakfast. By December 14, the ridge caps were on. Walter stood in the yard with the dog sitting against his boot while Phoebe checked the final line from the road. The roof was not elegant. 3 repaired sections showed where the old structure had wandered from square. But when sleet arrived that night, no water struck the bucket beside her bed. January began with powdered mortar on the hearth. The chimney bricks were not failing everywhere, only where years of moisture and freeze-thaw had spalled the outer faces. Phoebe could rub several joints with 1 finger and produce sand. Walter told her not to coat weakness with harder cement. Arthur agreed. She mixed hydraulic lime with washed sand and fireclay in the proportions written beside Adelaide's old repair note. 1 part hydraulic lime, 3 parts sand with a 1/4 part fireclay added only around the hotter throat and smoke chamber joints. The work took 3 weeks. Most mornings remained between 22 and 28 degrees Fahrenheit. Phoebe warmed water on the stove, carried it outside in a covered bucket, and mixed only enough mortar to use before it stiffened. She raked failing joints back to sound material, brushed away dust, dampened the brick-packed mortar with a narrow-pointing trowel, then tooled the joint after it began to thumbprint. She worked without gloves because she could not feel the mortar through them. Every 15 minutes her fingers became wooden. She would stop, put both hands beneath her coat against her ribs, wait until the ache returned, then begin again. On the north face she replaced 4 badly spalled bricks, with salvaged common brick close in size and porosity. At the crown, Walter helped her reset 2 loose courses and form a modest wash so rain would shed rather than collect at the edge. The test fire came on January 27. Phoebe began with paper and 3 dry splits, then added wood slowly while Walter stood outside watching the cap. Smoke drew clean. Inside, no haze escaped from the joints. Phoebe placed 1 hand against the warm masonry and left it there until Walter nodded. The white pine floorboards had survived because the old builders used thick planks and hand-cut rose-head nails rather than thin modern stock. Phoebe removed only the boards that had rotted completely near the rear sill. She numbered the rest in chalk, reset loose planks over sound joists, and drove old nails back only where their heads could still hold without splitting the pine. Arthur found her a random orbit sander at $14 per day. She rented it for $2. The first sanding pass used 80 grit to remove wax soot and the gray surface left by decades of damp. The second used 120. The third, late on the second afternoon, used 220 only on the cleanest boards because Walter warned her against polishing soft pine until finish could no longer enter it. Dust filled every crack anyway. Phoebe wore a borrowed respirator and emptied the collection bag outside beneath the walnut trees. By evening, the floor had changed from nearly black to irregular bands of pale gold brown and old resin stains. She applied the first oil coat with a lint-free cloth, working 3 boards at a time and wiping excess after 15 minutes. The second coat followed the next evening, the third 2 days later. Then she left the room untouched for a full 48-hour cure. The color deepened. What had seemed dark honey under dust shifted toward mahogany, where generations of spilled polishing compound had penetrated the grain. On January 31, Phoebe woke before daylight and could not make herself lift the sander, the broom, or the repair manual. She walked to the river instead. A great blue heron stood in the shallows where the current had broken a dark channel through the ice. It remained motionless for so long that Phoebe eventually sat on a flat stone and watched without expecting anything from it. She did no work that day. At dusk, she returned heated soup and looked across the oiled floor without apologizing to the empty room. There were 8 windows in the studio. 3 had no glass at all. 4 held cracked panes secured by old glazing points and strips of cloth. The 8th contained one wavering original pane, its surface full of tiny distortions and seeds in the glass. A notation, penciled inside the sash, dated that window to 1788. Phoebe preserved it exactly as it was. For the others, she removed loose putty with a narrow chisel and heat shield, careful not to scorch the sash. She bedded replacement panes in a thin ribbon of DAP 33 glazing putty, pressed the glass until the compound formed a continuous seal, set glazing points every 8 inches, then rolled the final putty into ropes and tooled each bevel clean against the muntin. The sash cords were worse. Several had snapped inside the weight pockets. Arthur sold her 1/4-inch cotton sash cord, and Walter showed her the old figure-8 knot used at the counterweight, so the knot would tighten under load rather than slip through the iron eye. Phoebe worked one window at a time. Open pocket, vacuum debris, check pulley, thread cord, tight weight, balance sash. By the 7th window, her hands knew the sequence before she named it. The last was the eastern workroom window above the amber bench. She fitted the lower sash on February 23rd and pulled it upward. For the first time, it stayed exactly where she left it. Outside, a chickadee landed on a bare walnut branch scarcely 6 feet beyond the glass. Its black cap looked almost too dark against the white morning. The bird turned its head toward her, then struck the branch once with its beak and flew toward the river. Phoebe lowered the sash halfway, raised it again, and listened to the counterweights move cleanly inside the wall. Nothing rattled. Nothing fell. She closed the window and stood with both hands resting on the repaired sill. The wall beside the chimney failed 3 times before Phoebe understood why. Old horsehair plaster still clung to hand-split oak cloth in most of the room, but heat and earlier water damage had weakened the keys behind that section. Her first patch cracked overnight. The second sagged from the lath. The third held 2 days, then separated along its upper edge. Arthur reached beneath a storage shelf and produced an old burlap sack. "My father's horsehair," he said. "Been waiting longer than either of us." Phoebe soaked the hair, teased it apart, and mixed it through lime plaster until the fibers spread without clumping. She pushed a scored scratch coat firmly between the oak strips so fresh keys formed behind the lath. After it tightened, she laid a 3/8-inch brown coat and left it undisturbed for 72 hours. The finish coat was barely 1/8 inch thick. She floated it slowly, keeping the surface damp enough to close without polishing it dead smooth. When the last patch began to whiten, Phoebe ran her fingertips across the wall. "These patches will hold another 100 years. The room gave no answer except the stove ticking behind her. Doris Pike began leaving paper bags on the doorstep every Tuesday. The cafe owner was a compact woman with red reading glasses hanging from a chain at her neck and flour always visible near one cuff. The bags contained things too plain for charity to announce itself. The heel of a roast, 2 biscuits, bruised pears, beans cooked with onion, yesterday's pie. The first time Phoebe carried money to the cafe, Doris folded Phoebe's fingers back around it. In candles when the shop reopens. After that, Phoebe washed every jar and returned every bag folded flat. Caleb Sutter arrived one Saturday on a blue Schwinn bicycle with a splitting maul balanced across the handlebars. I was tall enough to look unfinished with a knit cap pulled over his ears and one bootlace replaced by twine. He split the knotty maple Walter had avoided working beside the woodshed until the stack reached the lower window. Phoebe offered him $5. He backed away from her hand. My mother said, "About your grandfather." That was all. I rode home with the maul tied along the bicycle frame and one pant leg tucked into his sock. Reverend Boyd passed each morning just after 7. I was a narrow man in a black wool coat with a silver mustache and polished brown shoes unsuited to the mud. He never entered unless invited. He tipped his hat from the road, sometimes carried a fallen branch to the woodpile, and once held the ladder while Phoebe reset a gutter bracket. Before leaving, he raised 2 fingers toward the roof. "Keep this house standing." 4 words. Phoebe never learned whether he meant the building or something less visible. She did not ask. Phoebe postponed the cellar until February 11. The wooden door beneath the rear stair had swollen shut, and she had spent weeks stepping around it because the roof chimney and windows mattered more. When she finally planed the latch edge and pulled the door open, air rose from below, carrying stone-damp iron and old earth. 7 granite steps descended into darkness. The cellar floor measured roughly 12 by 15 feet and was laid in uneven fieldstone. Along the walls stood 2 empty shelving frames, a broken crock and rust marks where tools had once hung. At the center was something different. A dressed granite slab smoother and more deliberate than the surrounding stones lay flush with the floor. The 3-point craft mark had been cut into one corner. Phoebe crouched beside it. She remembered Adelaide's instruction at the walnut marker. She did not lift this stone either. Instead, while sweeping grit from the stairs, she noticed the 3rd tread did not meet the wall. A narrow darkness remained beneath its left edge. She reached into it and touched wood. A small oak box had been wedged behind the step. Its lid opened without a lock. Inside lay a brass key and a tintype wrapped in linen. The key was 4 inches long. Its bow had been worked into 3 small radiating points matching the polishing mark found on the tools, granite, and old drawings. Phoebe held the tintype near the cellar door. A young woman stood outside the studio in summer sunlight. The building behind her was newly painted. One hand rested on a polishing bow drill. Her face stopped Phoebe. The same narrow chin, the same heavy brows. Even the slightly uneven line of the mouth was hers. Phoebe turned the plate over. Written in faded ink on paper pasted to the back were 11 words. Clara Mercer, daughter of Mathis, age 25, summer of 1903. Phoebe carried the photograph upstairs and placed it beside Adelaide's letter. The brass key went on a nail above the mantel. She tried it in no lock. There were enough unopened things in the house already. Snow withdrew first from the road, then from the south wall, then from the roots of the walnut trees. By late March, the creek beyond the property ran loud enough to hear from the workbench when the windows were open. Catkins lengthened on the walnut branches. Mud replaced ice along the path to the pump. Phoebe could have begun polishing the stored amber. She did not. Instead, she cleaned the small, buff Trude 1 spindle by hand, repaired a leather drive belt, and practiced on cheap resin samples Arthur ordered for her. She decided the real craft could wait until her hands had earned it. From the hidden money, she would spend 1 coin on materials. 1. Everything else remained where Adelaide had put it. Through April, Phoebe practiced filing without tearing an edge, drilling under cold water, and holding a sample against canvas for less time than impatience wanted. The house was patient, so was she. 2 winters later, on December 18, 2024. Phoebe completed her first piece of amber that she believed deserved to remain in the Mercer workroom. It began as a cloudy Baltic fragment, smaller than the first joint of her thumb. She had studied its fractures for 3 evenings before touching a file. Beneath the oxidized crust lay no insect, no flower, no dramatic inclusion. Only bands of honey-colored resin formed long before anyone had named the river beyond the windows. She removed the crust in shallow strokes. Cold water followed the drill. The canvas wheel turned slowly enough that she could hear the seam in its old belt pass over the pulley. 20 seconds against the buff. Rest. Another 20. Rest again. When she stopped, the piece did not look flawless. One pale cloud remained near the center. Phoebe left it there. She drilled a simple opening and threaded the amber onto a plain linen cord. No platinum, no elaborate setting. She hung it on the brass peg beside Elias's lamp. The studio around it had changed without becoming new. The white pine floors still showed dark stains that sanding could not remove. Lime plaster carried small waves under afternoon light. The 1788 pane remained imperfect in its sash. The old counter had been scrubbed rather than replaced. Above the workbench, Adelaide's drawing sat beneath archival glass, while the repaired line shaft turned only the machines Phoebe had learned to trust. She kept the largest canvas buff exactly where she had found it. Its cedar-backed chamber remained useful. In October of that year, while clearing dead branches after a storm, Phoebe noticed something on the oldest walnut tree. A rectangle of green metal showed beneath moss where the trunk forked approximately 5 feet above the ground. At first, she assumed it was an old boundary tag. Then she saw the 3-point mark. Phoebe fetched the brass key from the mantel. The plate had no visible keyhole until she pressed the lower edge. A narrow brass cover slid sideways, revealing a warded opening packed with dirt. She cleaned it with a wooden toothpick rather than metal. The key entered halfway. She withdrew it, turned the bit, and tried again. This time, it seated fully. Something released inside the tree with a quiet mechanical click. The metal plate swung outward. The cavity behind it was not cut deeply into living wood. It occupied the hollow left by an old branch scar and had been lined generations earlier with a narrow copper box. Inside lay a folded 48-star American flag wrapped in oilcloth. Beneath it was a note. The paper had browned at every edge. Phoebe took both objects inside before opening the sheet. The date at the top was October 11, 1918. The handwriting belonged to Clara Mercer. Robert has been gone 6 weeks now, and the newspapers speak every morning of the fighting in France. Adelaide is not yet born. Samuel says I should stop putting things away for people who may never come, but I have lived long enough to know that absence is not proof of ending. This flag hung in the front room when the first men from our street left for the war. If Robert does not return, keep it with the medal. If someone finds these after we are gone, do not make a shrine of us. Use the bench. Open the windows. Do careful work. That is enough. Phoebe read the note once and placed it beside Adelaide's letter. The flag was small cotton and repaired at one corner with hand stitches. She did not hang it where sunlight could damage it. Miriam helped her find an archival textile box, and together they laid the folds flat between acid-free tissue. The metal required a different journey. On November 11, 2025, 107 years after the armistice ending the fighting of World War I, Phoebe carried Robert James Mercer's Victory Medal to Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx. Miriam had found his memorial record after months of searching. His body had remained in France, but the Mercer family marker bore his name. Phoebe placed the medal against the stone long enough for the bronze to cool in the November air. Then she took it home. She did not leave it where weather or a collector could claim it. Money changed the building more slowly than anyone would have predicted. Phoebe sold only enough of the old currency through a reputable dealer to cover inspections, taxes, materials, and the repair account at Sutter's Hardware. From the coin packets, she used 4 coins in total. 1 paid for roofing materials. 1 paid for chimney, brick, and lime. 1 paid for window glass and sash supplies. The 4th bought a small modern motor with an adjustable pulley, so the polishing line could turn at a controlled speed without destroying the old shaft. The remainder stayed wrapped. Phoebe made a new ledger page, wrote the verified contents in ink, placed Adelaide's letter copy beneath it, and returned everything to the hollow hub. At the bottom, she added 1 line. For the next one. The shop reopened without a sign in the newspaper. Doris made room on the cafe corkboard for an index card. Amber, repair and hand polishing Mercer Studio. By appointment, leave name and number here. For the first month, 6 people wrote beneath it. Then 12. By autumn, the list contained more than 40 names, though some wanted nothing more than a broken bead restrung or an old pipe stem polished enough to see its color again. Phoebe accepted only work she understood. When she did not know how to repair something, she said so. The most expensive object she handled that year belonged to a woman who had inherited a Victorian amber necklace from an aunt. Phoebe repaired 2 chipped beads and charged less than the woman expected. The least expensive was a brown fragment a retired schoolteacher had carried in his pocket since childhood. Phoebe polished it for nothing. Doris later crossed out the word nothing in Phoebe's account notebook and wrote 1 pie beneath it. Phoebe paid with Apple. Caleb returned in June carrying a plank wrapped in an old bedsheet. He had grown broader through the shoulders and no longer tied his boot with twine. The Schwinn was gone. A used pickup stood at the road, its passenger door a different color from the rest of the body. "I made something," he said. He leaned the plank against the counter and pulled away the sheet. The sign was walnut. He had carved the letters deeply enough to catch morning shadow. Mercer Amberworks and Daughters. Phoebe read the second line twice. Why daughters? Caleb shrugged. Because the records had them. He had been helping Miriam transfer old trade ledgers into archival folders and had noticed what earlier histories had shortened. Matthias began the work, yes, but Clara kept it alive. Adelaide kept it after Clara. The women had been entered as daughters, wives, widows, assistants. Caleb had decided the sign could be more exact. Phoebe ran one finger through the carved ampersand. "I am not anyone's daughter here." Caleb looked toward Adelaide's letter above the bench. "Maybe not only yours." They mounted the sign beneath the faded original board. Neither replaced the other. That autumn Phoebe began a letter of her own. She did not wait for illness. She did not wait until she was old. She sat at the workbench after closing, placed 1 blank sheet beneath Elias's brass lamp and wrote the first words slowly. "My dear one, whoever you are." She stopped there for nearly a week. Then she added what she had learned. Not the whole history. Adelaide had already preserved that. Phoebe wrote where the roof still required inspection after heavy snow. She recorded the motor speed that kept the antique line shaft below vibration. She noted that 1 part beeswax was too much on humid August days and that the old east sash needed its lower cord checked every 3rd spring. She wrote Arthur's name, Doris's, Walter's, Miriam's, Caleb's, Reverend Boyd's. She wrote that the money should not be spent simply because it had been found. She wrote that a person arriving frightened might not look grateful. Give them time. She folded the unfinished pages and stored them in the drawer beneath the bench. There was no reason to seal them yet. On some evenings after the last appointment, Phoebe opened both eastern windows and let the river air pass through the shop. The line shaft slowed. The canvas wheel turned once, twice, then stopped. Late light entered the amber fragments on the sorting tray, showing color in pieces that still looked nearly black from the wrong angle. Phoebe had learned not to force the angle. The roughest shell often exists only to protect what is still alive inside. In winter, the restored chimney drew a straight line of smoke above the walnut branches. In spring, the windows opened without sticking. Every November, Phoebe carried Robert's medal outside for 1 hour and returned it to the cloth packet before dusk. The platinum bead chain remained in its envelope. Clara's tintype stood on the mantel. The brass key went back onto its nail after the copper compartment in the tree had been cleaned and closed. Nothing important needed to be displayed every day in order to remain remembered. One December evening, Phoebe turned off the workroom motor and listened until the final belt settled. She locked the back door, covered the unfinished amber on the bench, and lowered Elias's lamp. Outside, the walnut branches moved slowly above the roof she and Walter had repaired. Amber Polisher's studio waits. It has always waited. And in the county records office, long after Miriam retired, an old wooden cash drawer remained in the bottom of her desk. The compartments had been emptied before the desk went into storage except for 1 folded bill caught beneath the rear divider. $10. Miriam had written 1 word across the paper band around it. Mercer.